and subsequent events of 1970, revolution of 1970. On the last lecture, I tried to explain the main features, the main ideas of this pre-revolutionary period. And we speak about the problem that the development of Russia after this liberation of society, not only liberation of souls, but liberation of society, the whole society, this self-government and maybe decrease of censorship and all other items, courts, free courts, with judges who were not, it was not possible to dismiss them. All this produced a very rapid development of Russian society. Economical development, social development, the increase of city population, the increase of literacy, and maybe it's necessary to say that Russia turned to be the second in the world state on the rapid of development, economic development. The first one was the United States, and the second was Russia. Total income of Russia was on the total income. Russia was on the fourth place after the United States, Great Britain, and Germany. It produced in 1914 7 and 4% of world production. Though the level of life was rather low, in the United States, for example, per capita it was $365, in Germany $179, and in Russia $66. But even this figure increased greatly. And on many items, the development of Russian economy was tremendous. For example, iron was produced, the increase of producing iron and cast iron between 1894-1914 was in 13 times, copper in 4 times, coal in 6 times, sugar in 4 times, cotton in 7 times. So it was really a great increase. You remember very well, I explained on the first lecture that the problem of Russia in the period of Crimean War in the middle of the 19th century was stagnation of economy, stagnation of society, maybe because of serfdom and other absolutist things of the rule of Nicholas I. Now the problem of Russia was absolutely different. It was too fast development of Russian economy. And the problem was that Russian society developed much faster than Russian institutions, political institutions. Up till the 1905, Russia continued to be absolute monarchy. And even after the first Russian Revolution of 1905-1907, it continued to be semi-absolute state. Of course, now Russia had parliament, Duma, State Duma, had constitution, but monarch controlled cabinet of ministers, controlled financial system of the country, and Russia continued to be semi-absolute state, though with political and civic freedoms, civic rights of the population. So it was very strange symbiosis of a rapidly developed society with some new political rights. For example, if you look through the Russian Constitution of 1906, April Constitution of 1906, you see that the rights of a citizen was written more liberal than a majority of other constitutions of Europe. And they try to be realized in practice. But on another field, Parliament of Russia had no rights and was controlled by the monarchy, by absolutist government. And in this rapid development of state and some stagnation of political institutions was great danger, because people of Russia start to understand that it is not their country. It is the country of Tsar. It's a country of bureaucracy. It's not a country of common folk, because common folk had no rights to influence the policy of the state. In peaceful conditions, in the conditions of peace, this evolution may continue rather natural and non-dramatic. Maybe, as you remember, in 20 years, as Stolypin said, Russia would be a standard constitutional monarchy, maybe in 1930s. But war occurred. And war occurred not because of Tsar, it's necessary to understand, but because of public. Just as in 1877-78, during the Russian-Turkish War, Balkan War, the majority of Russian people, now more educated, more active in their life, they were ill by the same illness as all Europe, illness of nationalism. So if in Germany people say about pan-Germanism, in Turkish world pan-Turkism, in Russia it was pan-Slavism. Pan-Slavism. And you know that even in Slavic provinces of Austrian Empire, for example in Bohemia and Moravia also, many people feel this unity with Russia, because Russia is also Slavic state. So the common language, though it was not so common, and people who speak in Czech can't be understood in Russian and vice versa, but common linguistic similarity produce the effect of political unity. It's very strange. If we think about this not in this publicistic sense, but in the sense of real closeness, we ask why? Why this similarity of languages ought to produce this idea of some new political reality, pan-Germanism, pan-Turkism, pan-Slavism. But it was. And when this tragic situation occurred, you know, this murder of Franz Josef, as Franz Ferdinand, and we now may suppose that this assassination was organized by secret Serbian police. We have documents on this field, not by King of Serbia, not by Prime Minister, but secret police, because it was an idea of unity of South Slavs, Austrian and Turkish, former Turkish South Slavs, under supervision of Serbia. But nevertheless, Tsar declared the state of mobilization, just as now in Russia. And the result of this mobilization was the war with Germany, then with Austria, with Central Powers. And in the beginning, in the first days of August, we see of 1914, we see Europe, almost all the Europe was in the state of war. Russian public was energetically enthusiastic. They supported this war on the first days. For the Slavs, they recollected this former war of Alexander II of 1877-78. And in Petersburg and other cities, it was great enthusiasm because of war. But this great enthusiasm, and in Duma, of course, in speeches of deputies, in papers, newspapers, but all this enthusiasm finished in 2 or 3 months. I don't know why, but Russian people were sure that they would be victorious over Central Powers. But in Eastern Prussia, first in Eastern Prussia, then in Galicia, situation turned to be not so optimistic. And maybe in the end of 1914, in the beginning of 1915, Russian people turned from great enthusiasm to great disappointment. And maybe it will sound strange, but this shift of attitude was not because of some tragedy of war, many victims, but because of absolutist power. Since if you have democratic state, you vote for some government, this government follow interests of his voters. If this government declare war, people who took part in this electoral process are the people who are the collaborators of the policy of state. In absolute state, and foreign policy was absolute prerogative of emperor. As Duma had no power to penetrate in international affairs. So it was the war of emperor. If emperor is happy in war, of course his chances, his admiration would increase. But if not, and again, we now see the same situation in Russia. Authoritarian rule produce great enthusiasm. If it is easy, if war is not tragic for the state, for example, in 2015, when annexation of Crimea took place, but produced great disappointment when war turned to be difficult, with a lot of victims. And I think that this situation is now. And maybe the same thing was in Russia. Russian life during the war was not terribly difficult. Life of the inner Russia, not in frontiers, was much more normal than, for example, in Germany or in Austria. There were no lack of products and other things. But people, I'm sorry, I forgot to do. But people understood this war as not their war. And they didn't want to spend years in battles and to lose their chance for peaceful life in their villages. And they failed to catch the reason for this war. Simple people can't understand for what this war occurred. Why Russian Tsar struggled with German king, the German emperor, and Austrian Kaiser. Why? For what? Though pure military situation turned to be in the 1916 better than before, the social and political mood of Russian people turned to be worse because population was exhausted, was terribly exhausted by the war. And in this situation, it was necessary to have a force, organized force, to change the state of regime in Russia. Germans were very active. They understood, even in 1915, that it's impossible to win this war by military means. And they tried to use some means of conspiracy. In all countries, in Great Britain and France, though Russia also used these means of conspiracy, for example, this is the activity of Russians among Slavs of Austrian Empire was one of the forms of this conspiracy. But Russian population was more adoptable for this anti-war agitation, because it was this Russian population was sure that it is not his war, it's the war of Tsar. And liberal groups, liberal straight of society, also was against Tsar, but because other reasons. They were for war, but they were for democracy, for liberal state, for constitutional monarchy, and not for absolutism. So Tsarist regime, the regime of Tsar, had almost no support in Russia. Among simple people, they don't want to struggle for war which is impossible to understand, and for liberals, and among these liberals were even members of Romanov's family, of Tsar family. They were for parliament and for liquidation of absolute or semi-absolutist rule in Russia. In formal political language, it was all power to State Duma. They want to have government which is controlled not by Tsar but by Duma. In the beginning of the 1917, military situation was almost perfect. Russia stabilized its frontiers. Russian industry became to work hard. There were a lot of weapons, but Russian population want changes in inner life and want to stop war. Liberals want to continue war, but without Tsar, and the majority of population want to stop war. There is one more reason, and this reason not often be mentioned. You know that Russian agriculture, Russian life in the villages was in general communal life. So it was communities. And there was a principle of reallocation of land. All the land of village was each 12 years was allocated again and again, because on these 12 years, new people born, some people died, and each family ought to have more or less land in these changes. And the year of reallocation of land was just 1917, and before it was 1905. So these revolutionary years are in some ways the years of reallocation of land. That's, and what is it, reallocation of land? The majority of Russian soldiers, both in Japan War and the First World War, were peasants. And they understand that without them, their core villages made new borders in their common land, not in their interests, but in the interests of those who continue to live in the village. And their wives, as women, would not fail to protect their lots of land. That's why soldiers want to return from army to their native villages to take part in this reallocation of land. It's very serious moment. If we speak about about the situation with motivation to war, we have one group of figures, not only words, but figures. In today's history, figures sound much better than words. And this is figures of victims and captured prisoners of war, captured people. There is some proportion. If proportion is a proportion of victims to prisoners of war is low, so for one killed or wounded person, there are more captured persons. It means that army is not good, that army don't want to struggle. And you see this proportion. For example, in the British Army, the proportion is 16. So 16 persons are wounded, one turned to be wounded or killed, and one turned to be a prisoner of war. In France, 9 and 9. In Germany, 9 and 8. In Austrian-Hungarian Empire, 2 and 2. In Russia, 2 and 3. You see that figures in Austria and in Russia are almost similar. But the reasons are different. Because in Austrian Empire, many Slavic peoples prefer not to struggle with Russians, and many of them even change their position and cross frontier and took part, turned to be members of Russian army. But nothing like this occurred in Russia. There were no groups of population who supported as groups of population enemy. So it was only one reason for this bad result between wounded and killed and captured is the unwillingness to struggle. Unwillingness to struggle. In France, in Great Britain, in Germany, the level was much higher. Why? Because of democratic system of these countries. War for these peoples was not Kaisers or kings' war, but was national war. And for Austro-Hungarian Empire, it was a war of Germans, maybe Hungarians, but not of Slavs. But for Russia, it was a war of Tsar, not of people. So we see in these figures that the majority of Russians didn't want to continue the war. And of course, if we have some political attitude of population, immediately emerged forces, political forces, who tried to exploit these interests, this mood of population. And in Russia, the struggle for popularity, political popularity, in 1917 was between two groups. Both of them were against political regime of Tsarist Russia. One group is city, cultured part of Russian population, which is represented in Duma by liberal or left liberal parties. I mean, Oktyabrists, Cadets, in Russian names, Constitutional Democratic Party. And another force was socialists, who wanted to liquidate regime, not only regime, but the state, the Russian state as it was before, in general, to organize constitutional assembly. And in Russian words, it sounds much more stronger than constitutional assembly. It's учредительное собрание, or organizing council. So they want to reorganize the state. Reorganize the state. Not to change some elements of political system, but to reorganize the state. And you know very well that at that time, socialist movement was very strong all over the Europe. The idea of the majority of socialists in Russia, just as in Germany, just as in Austria, was the same. To have really democratic elections, democratic political system, where all people, even poor people, even less educated people, even women, can take part in these elections. And in elections, socialist parties hope to win and to build socialist system, so the system with common possession of property, not private but common possession of property, legal So to build new system with socialization of property by democratic means, by the means of general elections. That's why these parties all over the Europe were named social democratic parties. They were for socialization of property by democratic means. And Russian parties of, for example, Mensheviks, social democrats, Mensheviks, were for this. But there were two great strengths, two forces which were against it. It was social revolutionary party, SR in Russia, who were sure that land ought to be taken by force from rich people to peasants, and another was Bolsheviks. The head of Bolsheviks was Lenin. They were sure that it's necessary to not to take power by democratic means, but to catch power by force and to establish dictatorship. And with the help of this dictatorship, to make all necessary changes in social system. But the idea of dictatorship was not very popular in Russia. So people had absolutism, and they didn't want to have new absolutism by Lenin or by somebody else. They want to have rights. Maybe not democracy. No, people can't understand what is a democracy, but they want to have some equality of rights. And the Russian system, pre-revolutionary system, was unequal. It's clear. That's why in these difficulties of war produced the activity of all political forces in Russia, and the simple people, the soldiers, the majority of simple people, were for socialists, not for liberals. They wanted to change everything. And the main ideas what to change were very simple. The greatest value in Russia is land. So, Russia was a peasant country. Peasants of Russia, after this liberation of serfs, turned to be the country where a majority of simple people, majority of peasants, had their own land. In private hands, had their own land. In Russia there were much more private owners of land, small private owners of land, than in the majority of European countries, where many lands were in possession of landlords and of some bourgeois estates. And these simple people want one thing. They want to take all land to their hands, since part of the land continued to be in the hands of landowners, помещики, and some in the hands of the merchants. In practice, the percent of this non-peasant land was very small, about 8 or 9% only. But people didn't hear it, didn't understand it. They wanted all land. And the force which say, we give you all the land, this political force for sure will be accepted by the majority of Russians, though no very bad literate or illiterate at all, people who can't understand the political system, with enthusiastic. So the majority of people will accept it with enthusiastic. Though this reorganization of land property may produce terrible damages in Russia. And only two groups were for this by force change of property rights. It was socialist revolutionaries and Bolsheviks. Another question was the property of factories. Also, the idea was that workers itself ought to govern, ought to rule the factories on which they work. Another problem, the problem of peace. Peace immediately. Stop war immediately. Not war, this war ought to be continued. It's necessary to stop the war. Of course, the majority of simple people and soldiers and military men in general were for this immediate finishing of the war, and to go to their villages for reallotted the land. The problem was what party will declare these items, though these items were impossible to realize. It was impossible to stop war immediately. The war may be stopped only by some international conference. And it's not easy to organize it when countries continue to struggle and hope to win. It was impossible to give land and not to spoil all the economic system. Of course, it was impossible to change property rights on the factories. But socialist parties declared they do it, and they immediately turned to be greatly supported in Russia. If Russia before had been more democratic and liberal country with more rights of common people, this propaganda of extremely left socialist groups would not be so successful. But Russia was not a democratic country, and that's why this propaganda was successful. And liberal groups who took power after the abdication of the Tsar, you remember it happened on the 2nd of March 1917, these liberal groups failed to preserve power in their hands. Step by step, these liberal groups, ought to give power to socialist groups, because the majority of population support them. And step by step, Russia ought to go away from the war, because people, soldiers, refused to continue their struggle, especially after the abdication of Tsar. This period between March and November was a dramatic period where all the liberal ideas of Russian democratic forces lost their validity in the brains of the Russian population. And socialist ideas increased greatly. And people fail to understand that these socialist ideas will not be realized. It is impossible to realize them. It's impossible to make them real in this situation of the beginning of the 20th century. People refuse to accept these ideas. It's impossible. It's only a phrase. It's only a slogan. Simple people believe in it. And if some socialist more consciousness, maybe more serious, say that no, we cannot stop war immediately. It's necessary to make some preparation. Or these men immediately disappeared from the political scene, and more radical persons took the support of the common folk. But people believe that this constitutional assembly will be able to build a new world, a new maybe land paradise in the land. They believed in it. And the results of Bolsheviks tried to catch power 3 times during this period from March to November. First attempt was in April, second in July, in the beginning of July. Both attempts were unsuccessful, and both attempts were made by German money. A lot of German money was used to recruit support among soldiers and simple people. It's necessary to know, for example, that the number of exemplars of newspapers, communist newspapers, increased from 25,000 copies per day in April to 1,000 copies per day in May, and to 350,000 copies in the beginning of July. Of course, and you know that at that time there was not internet, computers, even there was not a radio as mass media, only newspaper. So this newspaper, and you know that the main Bolshevik newspaper named Pravda, truth, and some variants of this. Soldiers' truth, is real truth, and other names. So, newspaper in each platoon, in each company even, in each battalion of Russian army, Bolsheviks, newspaper with this agitation began to spread during this revolution, during these months between February and November. Many people read it, many people who don't know, who were illiterate, they hear reading of literate their friends and believe in these simple words, but you understand that these thousands, hundred thousands of copies is impossible to be published without some support. And no one Russian rich person gives this support. This money came from Germany, came from Austria, and after the Second World War, when these archives of Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Germany were captured by Americans and then published, we now understand all this mechanism of transferring money to Russian Bolsheviks and to use this money for agitation, propaganda, and for real salaries for Red Guards. Red Guards received salary in money, in Russian rubles, which were printed in Germany. Of course, it was fails money, but they were used and they were done well, since Germans, all things done well. It's German work, and they were accepted by soldiers with pleasure. I don't want to say that revolution was done on German money. It's a mistake. You see that the motives for revolution, motives for this collapse of this former Tsarist state was in these Tsarist states. But Bolsheviks and some other groups, but Bolsheviks had a lion part of all money, used this German money for agitation and were successful. And almost all people believe that socialists and Bolsheviks among them changed their life dramatically to better result. No war, land, bread, and peaceful future. And on the 7th of November, not by some democratic elections, but by force, Bolsheviks caught power in Petersburg, and immediately, it was very well organized, they spread the revolution all over the Russia. Maybe in 1 week, maybe in 10 days, revolution, Bolsheviks' revolution was victorious almost all over the Russia. But just after February, the intermediate government, not Bolshevik, not socialist government, they start to prepare these elections to Constitutional Assembly. And Bolsheviks supported this idea of Constitutional Assembly, because the idea of democracy, the rule of simple people, was maybe some main principle of the revolution, to change from absolutism to democracy. So Bolsheviks, when they caught power, they had no possibility to liquidate this election or even to falsify them, as today Putin falsify elections in Russia. And these elections took part in November 1917, 2-3 weeks after the power in Russia turned to be in the hands of Bolsheviks. The results of these elections are very interesting and also very impressive, very impressive. You see that Bolsheviks took not, the activity among these elections was very high. It was about 62%. You see this country in revolution and war. 62% is a rather high level. And Bolsheviks took 23.7%. So less than 1/4 of votes. It's a rather large result, but not winning, since social revolutionary groups and parties, both main party and some ethnical, some local groups of social revolutionaries, Ukrainians, Muslim, Siberian, Kazakh, they took in general 59% of votes, so more than the half. Mensheviks lost everything. They took only 2%, and 1% people socialists. So these socialist groups were ideologically very deep. They were for social democracy in German sense of the word, but people decided not to support them at all, though they were active during the elections. The only one liberal party, Constitutional Democratic Party, took active part in the elections, but possess only 5% of the votes. 5%. In cities, in large cities, the level of votes of Constitutional Democrats, Cadets, yes, was much higher. In, for example, in Moscow and St. Petersburg, about more than 30%. In some cities, even close to 60%. But in rural periphery, nobody voted for constitutional democrats, because constitutional democrats spoke about land, that yes, land ought to be given to peasants, but only by law, and it's necessary to compensate landowners the land which is given from their hands to the hands of simple people. Peasants don't want to wait, and they fail to understand this, you see, juridically consciousness ideas of constitutional democrats. They wanted everything and immediately. It's maybe, and right parties, they were prohibited. And the monarchies didn't take part in the elections. But there were some Christian parties. It's also interesting. Socialists were against religion. Bolsheviks, social revolutionaries, were atheists. And atheism was one of the principles, and Mensheviks too. Atheism was one of the principles of democracy. Lenin himself used word God in the form Bozhenka only as some very negative term. And the majority of Bolsheviks and social revolutionaries follow the same example. But Christian part, political, and Muslim also, but Muslim parties at that time was more ethnical Muslim parties than religious Muslim parties. There was Muslim parties of Central Asia, of Tatars, but we speak about Christians. For example, Russia was a predominantly Christian state. And it's interesting that both in Ukraine, in Great Russia, in Siberia, Christian parties, both old believers and new believers, Orthodox new believers, there were different parties, but all of them won only 1.7% of votes. So less than 2% of Russian population in a situation where predominant parts are atheistic, vote for religious parties. It's a very significant moment. A Russian population turned to be not religious at that time. And there is also another sign of this, is the activity in Christian communion, Eucharistical communion. Before revolution, it was before the February Revolution, it was obligatory. All Russian soldiers ought to take part in this communion not less than once a year. Of course, it's not very often, but nevertheless. And people go to these field churches and took part in the communion. But, you know, as I have already said, there were many prisoners of war. There were more than 2.5 million of prisoners of war in Russia. And in these prisoner camps in Austria and Germany, according to the Gaga Convention, they were allowed to follow their religious tradition. And priests came to these prisoner camps to serve Eucharist, to serve sermon. But only 10% of soldiers in these prisoner camps go to the churches, and 90% not go. So, because there was not Russian force, there were not Russian officers, And after the February Revolution, only 1% in these prisoner camps continue to go to mass and to communion. So we see that the real percent of simple Russian people who were consciousness Orthodox people was about 1% of population at that time. Situation will change in communist future, and I will tell you about it on the next lecture. But in the 1917 it was 1%, and the same figure you see among voters who vote for Christian parties. So the Constitutional Assembly was elected, and it gathered on the 5th of January 1918. It's only one session. This session continued for 12 hours and was dismissed by Bolsheviks, who had state power in their hands. And this dissolving of Constitutional Assembly is a sign that democracy is finished in Russia and the dictatorship re-established. Not monarchists, but Bolsheviks. And the last question we ought to deliver now and try to find an answer on it is for what purposes Lenin and Bolsheviks wanted to seize power, to dissolve democratically elected Constitutional Assembly, and to rule as dictators. You remember that George Vernadsky, one of the well-known Russian by origin but working in Yale University in the United States, historian, Russian historian, wrote special book, Lenin, Red Dictator. But why Lenin and his compatriots, Bolsheviks, Trotsky and other, were for dictatorship? For people, to help silly people, fool people who cannot understand their ways of life, to help them to organize some prosperous life? Or for another very simple reason, because they want to organize their own life, to be the possessors of power, and to use this power for in their own interests, not in the interests of simple people who voted for them. This is the question, the main question, which is very necessary to find an answer to this question, because all Soviet communist system of the future, I mean from 1917 up till maybe even now without any ideology, is the answer to this great question. We use 3 lectures which will be in future for the answer to these lectures, for the answer to this question in history of Russia in the 20th century. But now it's necessary for us maybe only to fix the immediate result. Immediate result. People wanted to stop war. Do Lenin stop war? Stopped war? No. And in his theoretical works, he wrote that it's necessary to change imperialistic war to civil war. And he changed. And terrible civil war continued in Russia for 5 years, and the victims of this civil war, the people who lost their lives in this civil war, not only in battles but in all situations around it, was about 12 million. Much more than during the First World War, where the wounded and killed Russian people were about 3 millions, 3 millions and a half. So civil war turned to be much more terrible for Russian people than imperialistic, than standard war. The second problem is the problem of land. Do simple peasants received land? On the first glance, yes. On the second glance, no. Why? Because after the great reforms, peasants really were given a land, their land, as private peasants' property. The idea to organize private property, to diffuse property among the majority of population was one of the main ideas of reformers of this period of great reforms. But immediately when he took power, on the 8th of November 1917, Lenin, with the support of social revolutionaries, declared that all private property in Russia is abolished and all land turned to be national property. What is it, national? Of course, it's the property of people who possess power in their hands. And it was really so. From this moment, Bolsheviks used property as their own property, and not as a property of private property of peasants. So peasants really took some land of landlords, of merchants, but only as temporary possession, not as property. Property disappeared in the day of revolution. Private property disappeared in the day of revolution. Simple peasants failed to understand this difference. Practically, they caught land from landlords and were very happy. And they failed to understand that it's not their own land again. So, as to speak about property, we see that the Russia returned to the beginning of 18th century, to the time of Peter the Great, when all property was a possession of Tsar. There were not private property at that time, and then, during the reform, step by step, first the landlords during the Catherine the Great, then peasants, then all who can during Alexander I, then peasants during the reforms of Alexander II. All this private property was liquidated in one moment, and the only beneficiary of this liquidation was Bolshevik party, and not all the Bolshevik party, but the leaders of Bolshevik party, who can give property to whom he likes as a possession. And these Bolshevik leaders themselves took for their use the wonderful palaces, wonderful, very good cars, and what they like. Trotsky used to go in Tsar train, special Tsar train was confiscated by Trotsky, and so on. So these Bolshevik leaders preferred to live for themselves, not for the people by the name of whom they did this revolution. The same situation is with workers. Yes, immediately after revolution, factories were given to workers, but only for 2 or 3 months. Then they were taken by the state, and when workers of St. Petersburg and of Moscow start to asked for their rights, for salaries, for some other good things, they were pressed, they were under restriction by force. For example, during this well-known Kronstadt revolt of 1921, March 1921. Workers lost all their rights which they had before revolutions. No strikes, no workers' organization free from Bolsheviks. No elections at all, no democracy at all. Even socialist parties who took part in this, it named Soviet councils. So it was not parliament, but councils. But in these councils, socialist, non-Bolshevik parties could work only up till the June of 1918. After the June of 1918, all non-Bolshevik and groups were proscribed to take part in the elections, and so all opposition was absolutely dismissed. Even socialist or non-socialist was dismissed in the end of 1970. The problem of bread, you see, bread for hungry people, bread for hungry. Bolsheviks immediately prohibited all trade. You understand that without trade it's impossible to buy anything, for example, in towns and cities. And Bolsheviks tried to start to confiscate all resources which produced peasants. So this principle of slave force, which was in Russia before liberation of source, was reproduced immediately. In the beginning, in the spring of 1918, with confiscation of food and all property of peasants. And of course, hunger and starving was all over the country, and a lot of people died not because of war, civil war, but because of starvation. So no bread, but terrible starvation, terrible hunger. Another moment is safety of life. During the Tsarist regime, by court, about 3,000, I mean in the beginning of 20th century, about 3,500 people were persecuted, were killed by the sentence of law. In Bolshevik period, in September, officially was proclaimed Red Terror. So the right to kill people without any law, without any court, by the force of ЧК, special commission, which ought to force people to follow Bolshevik principles of life. And during the period of Red Terror, it's about from 1918 up till 1921, more than 100,000 people were officially killed. And many were killed non-officially in many villages and many places of Russia. So you see that Lenin immediately did, by his dictatorship, not the thing he said he will do during the revolution, but he immediately did absolutely alternative things, terrible things, and the only purpose of this his terrible deeds is not the interest of simple people, workers, peasants, but the only reason was to preserve his own power and the power of small group of leaders of Bolsheviks. Now we may ask the question, for what they want to have power? And to this question, we'll try to give answer on the next lecture. Thank you. Thank you, dear friends. Maybe some questions. Who will assist me in this microphone? Nobody? Oh, it's a honor for me. Who wants to deliver a question?
Thank you for interesting lecture. My question is regards to the elections. What do you think the liberal parties should have done differently to win and not to lose to Bolsheviks?
Yes. As to elections, I will give you literature, and there was a very good book. I used it, not new, but very informative in English. Oliver Radke, The Elections to Russian Constitutional Assembly. It was published in 1950, but with all statistics, and we have no better statistics now than collected this gentleman 70 years ago. So yes, and you can see in this book the results of elections in different provinces of empire, different front regions, different fleets. You see these results. Yes, the results were very clear. That all over there, Russia, which was not occupied by Germans by that time, socialist parties won, maybe only in some large cities. The constitutional Democrats were more successful. This was really general elections because all people up till 18 and I suppose 18, maybe 21, but really 18. And even women also took part in these elections. You know that, for example, in Great Britain, the first elections where women could take part were in 1919. So 2 years later than the elections of the Russian General Assembly. So it was representative elections. And there was elections for parties, not for persons. People elect for a number of parties. For Bolsheviks, for Mensheviks, though there was names which ought to be elected in each party, but the principle was not Westminster, but this not majority elections, but proportional elections. Yes, another question.
As you were talking about Czechs fighting in First World War by Russians,
yes.
I would like to ask you on this position because my grandfather was part of Czechoslovakia Legion and he was fighting in Russia. So I want to ask you what influence or what view Russians have on Czechoslovakian Legion or how they influence Russian history. Thank you.
Yes. As of course you know, there were Czechoslovakian not very large troops even before revolution. Some people from Czechoslovakia, part of Austro-Hungary, and other Slavic languages, for that Slovenia, today Slovenia, Julius Kraina at that time. They took part in these Russian regiments, Slavic Russian regiments. After the revolution, of course, these Slavic regiments, which were increased in 1917, took a great part in the struggle for Russia between communists and anti-communists. And I ought to say that without help of Czechoslovakian, these platoons, Czechoslovakian legionnaires, maybe anti-communist struggle even failed to start successfully. So the start of the struggle was because of the revolt among Czechoslovakians who refused to follow Bolsheviks. And all Russian historians who study civil war express their gratitude, who are not Bolsheviks, of course, express their gratitude to this impact of Czechoslovakian legionnaires to the struggle of against Bolsheviks. But you know that Russian people, it is the theme of the next lecture, the Civil War, so I will speak about more. I don't want to to overwrite, but since it's your personal question, because of your ancestors, I ought to say that for me personally also, I express great positive attitude to Czechoslovakian impact, to the struggle for free and non-communist Russia.
I would like to ask why there wasn't any huge negative response to the communist takeover after the elections, because when you said that there was a huge participation in the elections, yes, then it would make sense that if they tried to override the elections, there would be a massive response against them. And
yes, it was a response, but not massive, but rather interesting. Immediately after this Constitutional Assembly was dismissed, immediately some demonstrations, large demonstrations, were organized in St. Petersburg and in Moscow, with tens of thousands of people who were for Constitutional Assembly, all power to Constitutional Assembly, hands off Constitutional Assembly. But these demonstrations was fired by Bolsheviks. Many people were killed. Bolsheviks behave themselves worse than Tsar during this, you remember, Bloody Sunday of 9th of January 1905. And Bolsheviks, with no hesitation, ordered his troops who support them to fire to civil people with no weapons at all. And then the interesting result of this dismission of Constitutional Assembly was that all national regions of former Russian state, for example, Estonians, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, immediately tried to proclaim their independence, not to be part of communist Russia. Before during the elections, they took part in the elections. Ukrainians, Estonians, Lithuanians were occupied by Germans. Transcaucasian peoples, of course. And after this declaration that communists dissolve Constitutional Assembly will rule by dictatorial methods, all these nations tried to proclaim their independence, not to be a toy in the hands of communists. But communists immediately start to fight with these newly independent states, and Russian troops penetrated Finland, Estonia, Ukraine, and terrible struggle starts. Some, of course, Estonian, for example, Lithuanian and Finnish and Ukrainian Bolsheviks took part on the side of Bolsheviks. For example, the great-grandfather of today's head of presidential Russian administration, Vaino, Anwalt, was the head of Estonian communists and produced terrible crimes in Estonia, in eastern Estonia during this struggle. In Ukraine, the first war with Ukraine by Russia took part just after this dismission of Constitutional Assembly in the end of January and in February 1918. Here's the results. But you're interested in the themes of the next lecture, you see. And I prefer to answer questions on this lecture.
Andrej Borisovich, you mentioned briefly that the Russian liberals were in support of the war, and this is a fact that has always fascinated me, because despite how deeply unpopular the war was, you could see the cadets, even after the February revolutions, you know, Milyukov was making these speeches how Russia will finally annex Constantinople and the Turkish Straits, and I guess yes. I don't quite understand why were the Russian liberals so supportive of expansionism or of Russian imperialism.
You see, it was, of course, it was Russian imperialism in today's sense of the word, but you see, at that time, all states were imperialistic. British people, French people, Germans, Austrians, all were imperialistic. It was not, I suppose, I don't want to say that it's good, but it was the level of that day's mass political understanding of reality. You remember that I say pan-Slavism, pan-Germanism, Germanism, what? The pan-Turkism. This imperialist attitude was part of this feeling. Russian liberals were part of this mood of pan-Slavism, and they dreamed to see Constantinople in the hands of Russians. And as you know, on the conference in 1915, Entente conference, French and British Minister of Foreign Affairs agreed to give Constantinople and Armenian lands of Western Armenia to Russia. So liberals lived in this modern, at that time, system of understanding of reality. But for simple people who didn't know geography and didn't know what is it, Constantinople or Armenia, they think that peace without any annexions and contributions is much better. Maybe it's really much better. And, but at that time, the new principles, supported maybe only the United States at that time. But it is one of the reasons why liberals lost power, not in November 1917, but much earlier. The main liberal ministers of transitional government lost their posts in April, or maybe later, some of them in July. maybe.
So I think it's the last question.
Yes.
Or not?
No, since it's the second one, maybe it's the last.
The question is why there wasn't any crackdown against the communists.
Sorry?
Why there wasn't any crackdown against the communists before the revolution or the abdication of the Tsar, because it was clearly a very against the government, a very dangerous group. Why there weren't any actions taken against them en masse to oppose their activities?
Yes.
If they were
It's a good question. It's a good question, so it's necessary to answer it. You see, Bolsheviks almost lost all popularity in Russia during the beginning of the First World War. And they lived in exile in Europe and with no perspectives for good political future. But during when February Revolution occurred, February coup d'etat and abdication of Tsar, Bolsheviks were had very little power, very little popularity in Russia. But after this coup d'etat, when Lenin returned to Russia in April, then Trotsky returned to Russia in May, they declared things which no other socialist movement had a brave could declare. I name you these declarations, and it was maybe demonic, but genius of Lenin to see what simple people want to hear. And when he started to declare the things and use German money for propaganda in simple written newspapers for soldiers, his strength began to increase. The strength of Bolsheviks began to increase. Not by one moment, but we see from month to month, elections to councils, to Soviets, that the strength of Bolsheviks turned to the strength of Bolsheviks, turned to be more and more intense among soldiers, among simple people, and that's why they were succeeded in catch power, but it's necessary to add that they caught power by the assistance not of workers, and of course not of peasants, but of real soldiers, of organized platoons with their officers who were the members of Communist Party. It's necessary to understand. So thank you very much for your bravery to be for half an hour, 1 hour and a half on this lecture. Thank you very much.
We thank you.
It's necessary to switch off.
Yes.
How to do it?
I don't have my glasses, so I don't see where.
Oh.
Ah, here.
No.
No, maybe here. I think it's here.
No. Here is this.
But wait a minute. I think now it's.
Strange yellow.
I hope it's.
I don't know how to. Yes. Yes. It's necessary to ask somebody what to do. I have.